Before we get into the sermon, I just want to give thanks again for our guest singer, Mr. Onestine. That is simply extraordinary. Thank you so much for spending time. And we're going to start this sermon just for fun by playing a short video, so fingers crossed. The clip we're going to see is about 3 minutes long. Thank you, Linda. And I don't, unfortunately, have a lot of background detail about where this performance was. It's taken from a dance that was performed on Chinese television. The dance you're going to see is a representation of Avalokitesvara. And Avalokitesvara is a divine being known as a Bodhisattva. In Buddhist, Mahayana, and Tibetan mythologies, a Bodhisattva is a being who has attained enlightenment, but then, rather than passing on to nirvana, they elect to stay behind so that they can help others also attain enlightenment. So a bodhisattva is like someone who opens the door to heaven, but rather than passing on through, they stand on the threshold and they guide others through. And they make a commitment that I am not going to enter on through that door until every person has entered on through that door. Avalokitesvara is also known as she who looks down on the world. She is an immensely popular bodhisattva, appearing in many different variant local forms, because she is considered the personification of the kindness and compassion that lies at the heart of Buddhism. As you'll see, she is often depicted with 1,000 arms, which represent the many hands reaching out to help all of those people who are in need. So we're going to cue up the video here. If you're on the very outside, you might want to move in just a little bit. It may be difficult to see all the way on the periphery. Try it again. It's trying for us. Okay, let me try one more time, and then we have to call it a day, we will call it a day. I promise the sermon works even if the video doesn't. Here we go. You can find the rest of that video on YouTube. So many religious traditions, most religious traditions, have in their mythology, in their religious symbology, or in their beliefs, some kind of entity that serves as a personification of kindness and compassion. And these entities often serve as helpers to humankind. These are often supernatural figures. They could be bodhisattvas, as in the Buddhist tradition, or angels that our special guest musician sang about so beautifully in the Abrahamic tradition. They could be ancestor spirits or nature spirits, which appear in so many of the world's religious traditions. We might feel or have felt a literal connection to such a spirit in our own life, or we might see in these figures a recognition of the kindness and compassion that are part and parcel of whatever we call divine or sacred, and see in these figures our human longing for this kindness and compassion to act in the world. In a non-supernatural context, we might feel the presence of loved ones who have passed on before us and feel the spirit of their love and their life as a very real and active presence in our own life. How many people feel like my dad is still looking out for me? Or I can still feel my mother right here with me, or my grandmother, or whoever it is. There is a remarkable documentary in theaters right now about a man who served as the personification of kindness and compassion for several generations of Americans. The documentary is by filmmaker Morgan Neville, and it's called Won't You Be My Neighbor? And it's about the life and work of Fred Rogers, or Mr. Rogers as he is known to most of us. And if you have the opportunity to see it, I highly, highly recommend it. It is in theaters now. So Fred Rogers was a Presbyterian minister, he was ordained, who decided to make children's television his life's work, his ministry. And his work was driven by the conviction that the emotional lives of children were just as real and complex and worthy of respect as the emotions of adults. Fred Rogers liked to say that deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex. And he had one deep and simple idea that he conveyed to children as often and in as many different ways as he could, which is that each person is important, each person is worthy of love just as they are, and that each person deserves to be treated with dignity and kindness. There's no way to describe the documentary that does it justice, because there's no way to describe Mr. Rogers that does him justice. Fred Rogers simply embodied in word and deed, in every expression, every gesture, this immense kindness and this kind of guileless compassion and emotional transparency. He radiated kindness and compassion. And so to watch the documentary is just to be in the presence of that simple, radiant love. And it sneaks up on you. And by the end of the documentary, many, many people in the theater were just openly weeping. And I've read that that is a very common reaction in audiences all across the country. They see this man and they connect with him and they just cry. Because there's such a deep longing for what Fred Rogers represented and what he gave to the world. And that loving kindness seems so absent in so many ways from our culture and our discourse and in the events around us. And one of the things that was special about Fred Rogers was he had a remarkable ability to take children seriously and respectfully. And one of the things that he understood very well is the vulnerability of children. Right? He said children are smaller than everyone else. They're dependent. They can't do all of the things that they want to do. They make mistakes. And so the world they live in is big and confusing and often scary. And he would help them name their fears in a very straightforward way and give them words and ideas to help manage those fears. When I was a boy, Mr. Rogers recalled, and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, "Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping." And there are indeed scary things in the news. The world is a big and confusing and sometimes scary place for all of us. It's not just children who feel that way. I know I'm feeling it. And Mr. Rogers said, look for the helpers when you're feeling that way. So in the spirit of Fred Rogers, I wanted to offer today 3 stories of helpers with you. True stories of people helping, because I think we need these stories right now. And I'm going to start with a story that I actually shared with you last year. It took place last summer at Panama City Beach, Florida, from a Washington Post article by Katie Metler on a Saturday afternoon in July. 2 boys, age 8 and 11, they were out in the water playing on boogie boards, not too far from their parents, but they were both caught in a rip current, which is like a narrow channel of water where the tide is actually moving in the opposite direction, pulling you out, almost like a river inside of the ocean on its own path. And everything that gets caught in the rip current gets pulled out to sea. They are hard to spot. They are very deadly, even to experienced swimmers. And so these boys were caught in this current, and they were being separated from their parents. And the parents realized what was happening, and they went to help them, and they got caught. And then another young couple nearby, 2 young women, realized what was happening, and they went to rescue them, and they got caught. So the situation quickly escalated, and eventually there were 10 people caught up in this deadly riptide, each trying to help one another. There was no lifeguard on the beach. There was no rescue equipment available. By the time the police became aware of the situation, they called in a boat, but it was going to take a half an hour to get there, and they had already been struggling for almost half an hour. They were exhausted, and these 10 people were drowning. At this point, a crowd of onlookers had gathered on the beach, and they were watching kind of helplessly. They could see the people struggling just 200 yards away. They could hear their cries for help, and they knew that help was not going to come soon enough. That was when a woman named Jessica Simmons called out to the other people around her on the beach to form a human chain. She thought to herself, these people are not drowning today. We are going to get them out. So one by one, the people on the beach who were total strangers, some of whom who could not swim, they joined hands, they linked arms, and they began to form a human lifeline reaching out into the water. More than 80 people joined in, extending farther and farther out until they were near enough to the trapped people that Jessica and her husband, who had boards and were very strong swimmers, could sort of bridge the gap. And this was in itself a very dangerous thing to do, to willingly enter a riptide. But with help from the others, they were able to ferry these exhausted people, literally passing them person to person down the chain back to the safety of the beach. And all 10 people trapped in that deadly current survived. July 8th, 2017, thanks to 80 strangers who were determined that they would live, who linked arms and who made a difference. And I think of all of those linked arms as the literal manifestation of Avalokitesvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Think about how 1,000 arms can look like a community that has come together to do good. And I think look to the helpers. Our next story of helping is one that I heard for the first time a few weeks ago at this year's General Assembly, which is our big annual UU conference. I was there. And at GA, I attended a worship service that was put on by a Reverend Robin Bartlett, a member of the UU Christian Fellowship. And she shared this remarkable story, which I had not heard. It is a true story that took place on September 11th, 2001, that most awful of awful days. And on that day, 38 international flights carrying 7,000 passengers from 100 different countries were all diverted to the tiny town of Gander, Newfoundland, which had as its prime possession an airstrip. And I'm pulling details now from a 2016 Washington Post article by Petula Dvorak and a 2017 New Yorker article by Michael Schulman. Gander, Newfoundland is a town of 10,000 people with 3 stoplights. So when the 38 planes were diverted there on 9/11, the size of the town nearly doubled overnight. The need was daunting. 7,000 frightened, confused, stranded people representing many different languages, cultures, religions. And the townspeople opened their hearts and homes and businesses to all of them. There were naturally enough, not enough restaurants and hotels to go around, not even close. So they filled their schools and their churches and their community centers with cots, and when that was not enough, they put people up in their bedrooms and their living rooms and their homes. Bus drivers who had been on strike left the picket line and went back to work so that they could ferry these people to and fro. Bakeries worked around the clock to feed them. They shipped in underwear from 200 miles away. They arranged for kosher meals. They created a space for the Muslim passengers to pray. The townspeople also cared for 17 dogs and cats who were being carried in the cargo hold, and a pair of what are variously described as great apes, chimps, or bonobos. So whatever kind of primate it was, one of them was pregnant. And now there is a little chimp or ape or bonobo somewhere in the world with the name of Gander. The passengers were stranded in Gander for 5 days. And Schulman in the New Yorker article relates how on day 2, the mayor, this is quoting, he was at the Royal Canadian Legion Hall initiating marooned passengers as honorary Newfoundlanders in a ritual called Screeching In. He describes this ritual. Visitors wear yellow southwesters, eat hard bread and pickled bologna, kiss a cod on the lips, then drink the local rum called Screech while onlookers bang an ugly stick covered in beer bottle caps. The mayor says, we started off with 7,000 strangers, but we finished with 7,000 family members. The story of Gander is now being retold as a Broadway musical called Come From Away. And there's one more twist to this story. The people of Gander refused to take any money from the passengers in return for these services. So one of the passengers, a woman named Shirley Brooke Jones, who is now age 80, got the idea to pass the hat on the plane. And right there on the spot, they raised $15,000 for a scholarship fund for the children of Gander. But it turns out that Ms. Brooke Jones was also a professional fundraiser. So she kept at it when she returned home. And today, the Lewisport Area Flight 15 Scholarship has grown to almost $2 million. And 250 Gander High School students have received scholarships to this day. So kindness begets kindness, and help begets help, down into the next generation. Look to the helpers indeed. And finally, I want to share one more story of people making a difference. And I share this story in particular because I know so many people here who are teachers or tutors or big brothers or big sisters or CASA advocates or Boy Scout or Girl Scout troop leaders, or you teach or you mentor here at UUI, or you do like youth soccer, or whatever it is. So many people here have dedicated your time and energy and your hearts to making a difference in the life of a child. And that is one of the best kind of helpers you can possibly be. So this is a story from the NPR StoryCorps program, August 25th, 2017, by Tanya Ballard Brown. And it's the story of William Weaver, who in 1964 was 14 years old. He was a sophomore in high school, and he was one of 14 black students who was chosen to integrate a formerly all-white high school in Knoxville, Tennessee. And in the StoryCorps program, Mr. Weaver relates how on the very first day of school, the principal was reading the roll call, and he read his name, Bill Weaver. And William said, "My name is William," for which the principal called him a racial epithet and suspended him. 30 minutes into his first day, he was suspended. Every day, William remembers, he was told he did not belong there. On testing days, the teachers would stand over his desk while he took the test, and when the time expired, they would literally snatch the papers out of his hand. He went from being a star student to failing every class, including gym, he recalls. And he internalized it. He began to wonder if maybe he really didn't belong, or if maybe he wasn't that smart. So one evening, William recalled that Mr. Hill, his 7th grade science teacher from his old school, the African American school, came to his home. And he said, "I hear that you're having some trouble." And William said, yes, he was indeed having some trouble. So his old teacher said, this is what I want you to do. I want you to meet me after school every day and on Saturdays at your old 7th grade school. So William went there every day and on Saturdays, and every day Mr. Hill arranged for himself and other teachers covering a wide array of subjects to be waiting there for William Weaver, and they tutored him in math and English and science and history every day. And his grades came up, and he stopped doubting himself, and he began to excel academically. And it became a passion of his to excel academically, to prove to this school that he could, but they never recognized his achievements in any way for the entire duration of the time that he was there. And he recalls no one ever talked to him about college. So much to his surprise, his senior year, he got a letter saying that he had been accepted at Howard University with a scholarship. So he went. And today he is Dr. William Weaver, Chief of Surgery at the Fayetteville, Virginia Medical Center. Dr. Weaver told how 37 years after getting that letter, he ran into Mr. Hill at a funeral. And he said, you know, Mr. Hill, if I had not gotten that scholarship, I don't know what would have happened. And I don't even know how I got that scholarship because I never applied for it. And Mr. Hill replied, I know, because I filled in that application and I sent it off for you. So Mr. Hill stepped in, Dr. Weaver concluded, and I believe saved my life. He says, people ask, how did I get here? How did I make it? People helped you, whether you knew it or not. So who are the helpers in our own life? Who have been the helpers in your life? This was a question that Mr. Rogers liked to ask people all the time. At a commencement address at Middlebury College in 2001, he said, from the time you were very little, you've had people who have smiled you into smiling, people who have talked you into talking, sung you into singing, loved you into loving. So let's take some time, he said to the graduates, to think of those extra special people. Some of them may be right here, some may be far away, some may even be in heaven. No matter where they are, he said, deep down, you know they've always wanted what is best for you. They've always cared about you beyond measure and have encouraged you to be true to the best within you. So let's just take a moment of silence, Mr. Rogers said, to think about those people now. So let's us do that here now. Let's take a moment of silence, and I invite you to think about someone who has helped you, someone who has cared for you, someone who has loved you into loving or opened up your world to previously unseen possibilities. We're going to think for a moment, and I will chime the singing bowl to bring us out of it. Now, if you're comfortable, let's take one more minute, and I invite you to find someone near you, preferably who is not your spouse or partner, because odds are you will talk to them later today anyway. But if you're comfortable, find someone near you and share with them briefly who that person was that you thought of and anything else you want to share about them or what they did for you. We'll take about a minute again, and I will chime us out again. Find someone to share. Let's bring it on back. All right, let's bring it on back up front. All right. You people are really good at sharing. I invite you to continue the conversation during the coffee hour. In our first reading of the poem Shoulders, Naomi Shihab Nye describes a man crossing the street with his son on his shoulders, taking infinite gentle care with the life entrusted to him. His ear fills up with breathing. He hears the hum of a boy's dream deep inside him. We're not going to be able to live in this world, says the poet, if we're not willing to do what he's doing with one another. The road will only be wide. The rain will never stop falling. For Fred Rogers, love or its absence was the defining quality of human relationships and human life. He saw love of neighbor and love of self as the foundation of our ethical commitments from which all good things flow. By focusing our attention on helpers, he returned us to object lessons in what love looks like when lived out. Sometimes it is brave and bold and in the moment. Sometimes it is quiet and consistent and faithful over time. Sometimes it is dramatic and huge, but more often it is in the small and simple things. Sometimes in the simplest things, like the words, I like you. I'm glad you are who you are. I'm glad you're my neighbor. A message that Mr. Rogers spent a lifetime expressing, and which brought a room full of adults to tears in that movie theater where we sat together and received it. From this recognition of the love that you have received, from this place of gratitude for the helpers in your life, Mr. Rogers challenged us all to be helpers in the world. Late in the documentary and late in his life, in an address that he gave, he drew on the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, the repairing of creation. And he challenged his audience, and he challenged all of us to be healers of the world through simple acts of love, through recognizing our own worth and dignity, through seeing the beauty and goodness in others, and in exercising our own unique and particular gifts, whatever they are, to do good in the world. This idea, of course, is also at the heart of Unitarian Universalism. It is not a complicated idea. It is, as he said, simple and deep. Look for the helpers and be the helpers. Blessed be, and amen.